Robin Hood Radio and the Robin Hood Radio Network is proud to present Leonard Lopate at Large, lively hour-long in-depth discussions providing overviews and context to topics usually covered in partial measures. His guests include leading thinkers, scientists, artists, economists, farmers, historians, authors, and politicians. Mr. Lopate is a Peabody Award winner whose numerous honors include 3 Associated Press Awards and 3 James Beard Awards.
Welcome to Leonard Lopate at Large. I'm Leonard Lopate. The Trust for Public Land is a non-profit organization with a mission to protect and conserve lands and create parks. Since its founding more than 45 years ago, it has completed 5,000 park creations and land conservation projects across the United States, protected over 3 million acres, and helped get more than 500 ballot measures passed. Carter Strickland, the New York State Director of the Trust for Public Land, joins us now to discuss projects and initiatives that the organization is involved in New York City and New York State, and I'm very pleased to welcome him to our show.
Thank you for having me.
Is the Trust for Public Land a conventional land trust?
Well, I would say no, because we have, like a lot of land trusts, do conserve land, but we also build parks in cities, and we do a lot of planning as well.
Does it hold property interests?
We have some property interests, but in general, we try to be a park or open space developer where we get government or another land trust we set up to take care of it over the long term.
What's your relationship with community groups, public agencies, other conservation NGOs?
Well, very good. I mean, in general, we see our role as bridging those gaps. So we're very much into public-private partnerships that bridge what's oftentimes a very significant gap between the government and community groups. And so we do a lot of listening with community groups to understand what their park needs are, their open spaces needs, and then work with governments to make it happen.
So you have to work with the politicians as well.
We do. We do.
New York State has both millions of acres of wilderness and also large urban areas, including one of the world's largest cities. So how do you allocate the organization's attention and resources?
That's a great question.
Because there's always this war between downstate and upstate in pretty much every state.
I know it very well. I'm an upstate New York native, and so I grew up hearing about how New York City was driving up taxes, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, 30 years ago I moved here, and I've been a New York City native ever since. So I enjoy both. I think a lot of people enjoy the urban experience and the rural experience. We allocate our time. We have 2 main programs: conservation program, which is active both in New York City, protecting the open spaces left in New York City. Of course, it's more expensive, and also building parks. And the park construction we've done has largely been in New York City because that's where the people are.
And that brings me to some of the things that New York City has gone through. For example, didn't Superstorm Sandy dramatize the importance of preserving low-lying coastal lands? We don't think about low-lying coastal lands when we're thinking about a city.
We don't, and there's nearly 500,000 people living in a 100-year floodplain in New York City, and that's the number of people that were asked to evacuate in 2011 during Hurricane Irene, and then just a few years later, just the next year actually, in Hurricane Sandy. It's critically important. We were conserving land back before Sandy when we weren't thinking about the resiliency lens quite as explicitly. And thank God those parcels we did actually protect the city during Sandy.
Because I was wondering what happened to your waterfront projects in Brooklyn and Staten Island as a result of the storm.
Well, the good news and the reason why open space is so well suited for coastal areas and to be a buffer is that it does pretty well. So post-Sandy, one project we were not involved in, but that I often use was Garrison Creek. That's a project where the city of New York, the Parks Department, which is really a fantastic resource for the city and one of our pride and joys, they had done a rehabilitation of Garrison Creek, a degraded former wetland landfill, and actually after Sandy it did better, which is very interesting. There was a lot of dead trees and wood and other material that was lifted off by the rising tide, I hate to say it, and deposited inland, of course, but the creek did better. So those wetlands can protect and certainly buffer the storm surge.
Would we call it green infrastructure?
You could. I mean, that's a term I like very much. It sometimes is a very specific term, but if you look at all the forests and wetlands in New York City, it's green, and it's certainly infrastructure in the sense that it is providing really important services to us, like during a hot summer, shade.
Can you identify critical conservation sites based on what happened during those storms?
Well, it's interesting during Sandy. I mean, I was working for the city at the time, and afterwards we looked at the extent of historic wetlands and the extent of flooding during Sandy, which many call 500-year storm, and it's almost exactly the same.
No, we've been having a lot of 500-year storms. We just had one in the south.
What's interesting is that yes, that's true. We're going
to see probably more and more as a result of
coastal science,
global warming.
Correct, and coastal scientists will tell you that 500-year storm is just a 0.02%, every year, right? Mm-hmm. So, you're rolling the dice every year, and those odds that were long are getting shorter and shorter as sea level's rising, and that's pretty well documented. There's no question. There's over 100 years of records at the Battery in New York City, and we're seeing rising tides.
So what areas are you focusing on?
Well, Jamaica Bay is one area that we've historically focused on. And as I said, we were protecting that land in the decade before Sandy, and many of those parcels are now protected, like Beach 88th Street, and are becoming parks. We've also focused on really land that's available. I mean, and that can be protected. One project we did a number of years ago is East River Park in Williamsburg. That's remained relatively undeveloped. Right next door is Bushwick Inlet Park. That is a city site. East River Park is a state site.
That's the park at the end of Broadway in Williamsburg?
It's at the end. It's at Kent and North 8th or 9th Street. And, it was a former, like a lot of waterfront land, it was a former manufacturing shipping facility that fell into disuse and was abandoned for many, many years. Those are the kind of sites that we look at, try to rescue if we can get a government interested in buying it from us.
Aren't they mostly paved over concrete rather than grassy?
Many are. You can rip up the concrete. You can rip up the asphalt as well. But a surprising number of sites were, just are bare dirt, so that can be protected.
You mentioned Jamaica Bay. Would that be called a wetland?
Around Jamaica Bay historically was a wetland. If it hasn't been filled in too much, then it can come back as a wetland.
Why are wetlands important?
Well, wetlands, a number of reasons. It's half land, half water, if you will, but it's shallow areas, and that has a number of benefits. One, it's a nursery for fish and other small creatures, so that they're not preyed upon immediately. They can grow up. Secondly, it can provide spartina and other grass to hold that, like mangroves, will hold the soil together but need to get their feet wet, so to speak. And that shallow area attenuates waves. So when the waves come in, they'll diminish if you have unprotected areas where those huge waves are coming up against a bulkhead. It's a very powerful, very destructive force.
So they serve as buffers?
Yes, they do. They also sequester a lot of carbon. Birds love them. So, they're really wonderful sites within the city.
Because of that, are wetlands most important in urban areas?
You could almost say that about any green infrastructure, that what we call ecosystem services will have a stronger effect in a city. So, yes, a tree on a city street is, if you can quantify it, worth more than a tree in the middle of a forest. On the other hand, one reason we're active upstate and in more rural areas is that you can protect really big tracts. And sometimes for wildlife habitat or just recreational enjoyment for people, you want to walk a 2,000-mile Appalachian Trail, and the small sites are not enough. We think you need both.
How did the areas protected by wetlands in, let's say, Staten Island do compared with those that didn't have them to buffer?
Well, you know
Because
what?
Staten Island was hit pretty hard by
It was
these
hit,
storms.
and tragically, a lot of people lost their lives right around Great Kills. I happen to know that because there still is, a wastewater treatment plant there, and that is kind of a lesson in how you can make structures more resilient. That wastewater treatment plant, Oakwood Beach, was raised in the late 70s when it was created, about 11 feet or so. It survived. It was an island in the middle of a storm. But those houses around that North Great Kills area got really wiped out. And we saw post-Sandy entire houses just off their shorings right in the wetlands. It was terrible to see.
In cities, aren't wetlands vulnerable as targets for development?
Well, they can be very hard to build on. So that's why a lot are still protected. Before the wetlands
Are there zoning laws that protect them?
Well, what really protects them are state and federal wetlands laws that prohibit you from filling them. Those didn't exist until the mid to late 70s, and then they had to be mapped. So we have developers who hold land that they bought before that period. They have more leeway to do things. And, of course, historically, like in Canarsie and other places in the city, a lot was filled. So historically, you'll find rubble there. That precludes it from being a wetland now.
People dump rubble to...
They did back in the day. And a lot of those landfills, actually, Garrison Creek I mentioned, were, a lot of those wetlands, I should say, were landfills. And so you'll find bottles there and old shoes and, everything else. So it's a challenge to bring it back. You can bring it back. It's just more expensive.
Could you build on land where there's bottles down in the ground?
If you had deep enough pilings, you could. You certainly could.
You mentioned the Appalachian Trail. I've spent some time upstate near the Appalachian Trail, and a large preserve in Dutchess and Putnam counties that's called the Great Swamp. There are great swamps in a number of states. New Jersey has a great swamp.
They do?
But is the New York State Great Swamp one of the conservation areas that you're involved with?
We are involved in that area. It's very interesting. That whole area in the Taconic area between Connecticut and New York is fairly rural, even though it's only 90 minutes or so from New York City, and it stayed that way for a long time. In part because New York and Connecticut couldn't decide where the boundary was for a long time, and there was an area that no one wanted to invest in. I'm talking about colonial days, except the Quakers, who were running away from religious persecution in New England. So there's areas called Quaker Hill. You can see it reflected in the land. And that is an area where there's land available to buy.
This is not part of this conversation, but I have an interesting story about Quakers and Quaker Hill. The Quakers who settled there before the Revolution were rather progressive, and they abolished slavery. And Quaker Hill, this area around towns like Paulding and Paterson, became the last stop on the Underground Railroad.
That's incredible. It's incredible history there. And that whole, what they call the Harlem Valley, is an area where we've been very active protecting land. In fact, we just last month closed a 200-acre addition to the Appalachian Trail there that's surrounding endangered species habitat. And we think that's a very important way that we can protect the wilderness experience. When you're in a place like New York, you're in a national park. It's in our backyard, and we want to feel like a national park.
I'm speaking with Carter Strickland, the New York State Director of the Trust for Public Land, here on WBAI New York 99.5 FM. So why do you think that the Great Swamp, a 6,000-acre watershed, is so little known, even though it's not all that far from New York City?
That's a great question. I mean, there are wonderful natural resources in and around a half-a-day drive or even a few hours drive from New York City. Swamps can be difficult places to navigate, and the reason why it's a wildlife refuge is also the reason why it can be hard to cross, except where you have trail access or there's a few boardwalks that do make it available.
The Appalachian Trail has a boardwalk that goes over the Great Swamp.
It does. In fact, I want to put in a plug for that property. It's the only mass transit, you could call it, stop on that whole 2,100-mile Appalachian Trail. It operates on the weekends. Metro North operates it on the weekends and holidays. It's a little whistle stop. You have to get in the last car, request a stop. It will drop you off. It will pick you up. Better not be late. But right there is a boardwalk that is also handicap accessible, so that all people can see that portion of the Great Swamp. It's really quite impressive.
Well, does the Great Swamp have a function? Does the city have a vested interest in having this swamp, this area there?
Well, that whole area in general, north of the city, not in Dutchess County, but certainly in Putnam and parts of Westchester, are part of the Croton system, watershed system, which is the old system that was developed in the 1800s. Later on, the city went west of the Hudson to get water that's of better quality, but all wetlands do filter water, especially when you have agricultural runoff, and as headwaters can result in cleaner water downstream.
So New York City water to some degree is affected by this swamp that's up there?
Well, I think this swamp is just outside the watershed, but you could say that about a lot of similar pocket watersheds around.
You mentioned Putnam County in particular. Earlier this year, it was hit by a powerful tornado. Is that related in any way to what we're discussing? Trees were down everywhere, and it was kind of the sort of thing that I would associate with Oklahoma, not New York State.
We are, it's interesting. We've had a lot of tornadoes in the last, for us, it's all relative. We're not Oklahoma yet. Over the last decade, we're just seeing more violent weather in general. A lot of that's, tied to climate change. As the whole planet gets hotter, it's like a boiling pot of water. There's just more happening. The atmosphere is wetter. We're getting heavier rainstorms and wilder winds.
Is there a problem for the Great Swamp in that it's called a swamp and not a watershed or a natural habitat? Swamp is a word that suggests something ughy.
It does. I mean, that part of that's a marketing problem, I guess. I love the idea of bogs, and that's another term that maybe some people don't like.
But marsh is okay.
Marsh sounds great. The swamp, of course, Trump famously recently made that a negative word, but for those of us in the environmental field, we think all wetlands, whether they're called marshes, swamps, bogs, are really, really valuable.
And you mentioned earlier they attract many different kinds of animal species.
They do. Many of which are protected. So protected I won't mention them here because we do worry about collectors going up and illegally taking those animals for sale, which is terrible.
The Great Swamp appears to be run mostly by volunteers, including people who are in charge of emptying the garbage cans in the parking lot. Is that a typical arrangement in the state?
Well, we look. There's a lot of public lands in the state, and they do require a lot of volunteer maintenance. And people are very happy to pitch in and help, whether it's an urban park, a lot of friends have groups, whether it's a conservancy, a little bit more formal, or volunteers who are maintaining trails or picking things up. So, yes, I mean, in a way, while it can be seen as a burden, it's also a way for citizens to make it their park and have some skin in the game.
So does your group, the Trust for Public Land, work in coordination with those groups of volunteers like the ones with the Great Swamp called Friends of the Great Swamp or Frogs?
Yes, Frogs with two G's. Yes, we do. Not only will they help us identify parcels of land they think are worth conserving and will come in as real estate experts, but they'll often take over the obligation of operation and maintenance. For example, when we did our Appalachian Trail project most recently, we worked hand in hand with New York, New Jersey Trail Conference, a great organization that, as volunteers, maintains the Appalachian Trail in New York.
I bet many people don't even realize that an awful lot of the Appalachian Trail runs through New York State.
It does. And one of the first stretches was in Harriman State Park, which is a wonderful state park. And there's some great stretches of the Appalachian Trail there. One of my favorites is Fingerboard Mountain, which is just, you go up there, there's fields of ferns. You don't think you're within an hour drive with zero traffic from New York City.
Well, Donald Trump is from New York City, but he doesn't seem to know that there is a place called the Appalachian Trail. When he was talking about Mark Sanford recently, he said that he claimed he walked the Tallahassee Trail, and that when he was actually in Argentina canoodling with a flamingo dancer, he said. But is this a problem that a lot of people aren't even aware of this incredible thing that runs from Georgia to Maine?
Georgia to Maine, 14 states, over 2,100 miles. It's pretty incredible, and actually, it is one of the I think it is the most diverse unit in the National Park Service in terms of terrain and species. So there's a lot of elevation changes. Obviously, Appalachia as a group has some commonalities, but when you're talking about a trail that runs from Georgia to Maine, you'll get different tree species, different animal species, plant species, and the like. The idea in our involvement, the trail is 99.9% protected and owned by the National Park Service. The question is the buffer. If in general it's about 1,000 feet wide, if there's a development within view of a mountaintop or a little viewpoint, or even commercial development like a mall that was next to the trail and proposed next to the trail in Pennsylvania, that really won't make it a wilderness experience. And go back when the trail was conceived in the 20s, the idea was for people really to have a respite from, interestingly enough, a respite from the hard work of the dirty cities, right? Of course, and that it's a day's drive from, then and now half the people in the U.S., which is pretty incredible to think about. But also as kind of the idea back in the 20s, which is never fully realized, but it's interesting to think about, is a series of work camps. And the idea that it was, people would sort of recreate but put in effort. And so if you think about the volunteers who are putting in time on the trail today, they're a little honoring that sentiment.
In light of global warming and the increasing numbers of dramatic weather events, will wetlands matter more and more?
They will, and in fact, there's a few interesting things that are happening that we have to think about. They'll matter if they're still around. And
what would happen if this swamp was drained?
If the swamp were drained, you'd have, when it rained, which it's going to do, then the runoff would be much more severe. It wouldn't buffer, it wouldn't go into this pool of water and then be released gradually. So it would flash flood downstream, impose danger to bridges, free up a lot of sediment. It'd be dirtier water. So we need to slow down water and spread it out. The thing about coastal wetlands is that sea level rise is really gobbling them up. There's a very limited tolerance range of how deep it can be. You're not going to have a wetland in 10 feet of water. 10 inches, yes. So as the sea level rises, wetlands are going to want to migrate inland. And when you have a roadway or a building on the land side that prevents it, they're going to disappear, and we're seeing that already.
Many people want to have waterfront properties. Are they destroying the environment to some degree so they can have beachfront?
You never want to say an individual is destroying the environment, only because
it's a whole matter of policy. Some states allow more development along the coast than others, or along waters, riverfronts, and the like.
Yeah, I think that is true, and a lot have more protected lands, and that just makes sense in the long term. I guess the reason I don't want to make it an individual matter is there's a whole system. Our insurance policies, land use policies, zoning policies, all make it seem like it's a good deal when you're buying waterfront home. If it's on a bluff, maybe it will be okay. If it's 1 foot above sea level, people need to know that their investment might be at risk.
I mentioned that the Trust for Public Land gets involved with ballot measures. Are they often addressing the thing that we're discussing here?
The ballot measures we get involved in are really giving us the means to buy land, conserve land, and build parks. So we were just involved in one in Dallas, of all places, where we got $300 million passed by local citizens who are willing to tax themselves to develop parks. Yeah, in Texas. And people love their parks. One saying we have is that when people vote on environmental measures, they vote green. They're not voting red or blue. They're voting green. You're seeing this right now play out on a national level with the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which was expired on Sunday, unfortunately, but there's bipartisan measures to reintroduce it. So this is an excise tax on oil and gas development offshore. It's been around for a while, authorized at $900 million, and in recent years, when the administration has threatened to zero it out, we've actually got it funded at $425 million.
Different administrations over the years.
Well, I'm talking about specifically about the Trump administration that wanted to zero it out. We have enough land, and what I'm saying is that Republicans and Democrats got together and said, no, this is a program we want. So that's what makes us hopeful that it will again get reauthorized this year.
Was preserving marshes the goal of your project at Salmon Creek?
Salmon Creek, upstate.
Yeah.
Salmon Creek. Now I'm looking at our map. We've done so many projects upstate that protected over 125,000 acres. That one, I can't say that was a wetland project. No, they're not all wetlands projects. I mean, many of them are projects of historical significance. Many of them can be access ways to parks. We try to add on to existing parks when we can.
You've worked on 2 projects in New York City with the Audubon Society. How important is the Jamaica Bay Shoreline Park for birds?
It's very important. We did, starting in the 80s, we did a Harbor Herons report that looked at the areas that are important for migratory species.
We have herons in New York City?
Oh, we have lots of herons. Great blues, night herons, which are beautiful, smaller bird. In fact, I just saw one in Brooklyn Bridge Park. They're very common. They're great predators. Egrets. Jamaica Bay and the whole eastern seaboard are along the Atlantic Flyway, so it's very important to protect those stopping areas when birds are on their thousands of mile migrations.
Adrian Benepe, who also is with the Trust for Public Land and used to be New York City's park commissioner, says that the Brooklyn Bridge Park is his favorite in the whole country. Is it so good partly because we've learned a lot about what makes a park good?
I think that's true. We have. It's one of my favorite parks, if not my favorite park, because it's the closest one to where I live.
Maybe he said in the city. I'm not sure. But
it's a great park. And every time we build a park, we're learning more and more. So that's one of the newer parks, and it's really well designed. The way they're rolling that out with alternating active recreation and passive recreation piers and wetlands areas that really do work. So you can go by Pier 1 and see the beautiful hills, enjoy the sunset, sometimes movies when they have those nights. But then there's a working wetland that separates that peninsula from the mainland, and it's wonderful to see the water rise and fall.
What was that land being used for before?
Warehouses. It was and actually immediately prior, empty warehouses, and there was a lumber yard.
But this is when the Brooklyn waterfront was active. We had a major Navy yard.
Yes. They're still, this is a little south of the Navy Yard area, and that's being redeveloped for commercial, industrial, light industrial purposes, which is great. Brooklyn Bridge Park area was coffee warehouses and things of that nature. And most recently in the 90s was, they think they were desperate to lease it out. No reason for a lumber yard to be on the waterfront, but that's what they were using the land as. At
that time, ships were dropping the lumber there.
Sure. Well,
now everything comes in by truck anyway.
That's right. Rail. I think Robert Moses was trying, not Moses from the Bible. Robert Moses was trying to grapple with how to get New York City, help its transition away from being a port city. Even back in the 50s, of course, he overshot in his favoritism towards cars, famously. But cars and trucks are how we get the last mile.
Robert Moses seems to be a mixed bag. He gave us some great parks and did some wonderful things, and then he did some pretty awful things. He destroyed neighborhoods, putting roads through neighborhoods that he probably shouldn't have done it that way. Sometimes going around rich people's property and going through poor farmers' land. But he did give us Riverside Park and a whole bunch
famously, 11 pools in 11 weeks in the heights of the Depression. So, yeah, I mean, it is a mixed bag. I think one thing we've learned is, process, and that you really should, as a moral issue, and also have to, just as a pragmatic issue to get anything built, listen to people and work with communities.
My guest on Leonard Lopate at Large today is Carter Strickland, the New York State Director of the Trust for Public Land. Let's talk a little bit about your work in the city. Did the 10-minute walk park project, how did that evolve?
Well, it evolved from a study we've done over the last few years of how many people actually live within a 10-minute walk of a park. We know there's a lot of research out there that parks are good for mental health, physical health, as we know, community health in terms that people get to know each other, social resiliency. And parks are really only used. The big parks are destination parks, of course. You might make a special trip to Central Park, but the park you're going to use day to day is within a 10-minute walk of where you live. And we think it's very important. We have a whole 10-minute walk campaign that we launched last year on October 10th, 10:10 at 10:10 a.m. To really drive the point home that everyone in urban America should live within a 10-minute walk of a park.
Research has been done?
Yes.
What does it say about close-to-home parks? How do they affect the community?
Well, there's a very interesting study that was done about the heat wave in Chicago, and I really want to tip my hat to NYU professor Eric Kleinberg, who has studied this and shown that some communities, if you control for demographics, if you control for poverty levels, if you control for education, nonetheless, in the mid-'90s when there was a heat wave in Chicago, his hometown, a lot of people died in some neighborhoods. In a similar neighborhood by those measures, people survived. And you wondered why. And, it really had to do with social isolation of seniors. What does that have to do with parks? Parks are where you meet your neighbors. Parks and public spaces are where we see each other. We're not isolated. People will take care of themselves. On the physical front, there's studies that have measured actually hormone levels in your bloodstream and your brain, and we are more relaxed when we're in nature. They say 20 minutes in a park is equivalent to dosage of ADHD, which is why kids really need to have outdoor spaces to play during the school day.
But there are parks and there are parks. Not all parks really give you very much nature. So how do we even define a park in this context?
You're really asking a metaphysical question. That's a really great question. I mean, all public spaces, the urban planners will use the term public realm. So anywhere we are. But yes, a sidewalk is not a park. There are certain park functions it can serve, though. If you look at where people can gather and protest, exercise their First Amendment right. It can be parks, it can be sidewalks, it can be streets for that measure. Where can we walk? Non-motorized transportation. All of the above. What do parks allow us to do? Play, have fun, experience nature.
Often meet our neighbors.
Meet our neighbors, of course, and you can meet them in the stoop for that matter. We would call that a park. We can, have either organized or disorganized sporting events and the like. It's managed to accentuate those traits that we want in parks, which are places to recreate, have fun, relax. A lot of parks, when we talk about active recreation, that's a sports field. Passive would be sitting and watching the sunset, which is lovely.
The Trust for Public Lands website has a program called Park Score that evaluates cities on the basis of the 10-minute walk. Where does New York City rank?
Well, they've typically ranked number 7. This year they're number 9. Chicago passed us because they invested in some of their parkland. So it's a measure that looks at access to parks, which is pretty good in New York City. It's actually quite good, I should say, 97%.
Some boroughs better than others?
Some boroughs better than others, some neighborhoods better than others. We're trying to focus our work in, for example, central Brooklyn, where there's a big park need in what we define as park deserts, which is people living outside of a 10-minute walk to a park.
Has anyone done a study about whether creating a park space improves a neighborhood economically?
Oh, yes. Yes, yes. We do a lot of those studies, actually. We've done it both on a statewide basis. We did it for all of Long Island. We do it for cities. And it does show that it does improve the neighborhood, both in terms of property values, fighting crime, lower crime. That's very well proven. There's, most recently studies in Philadelphia showing that even cleaning up empty lots and making them green and well kept increases public trust in government, increases public trust in their neighbors, and reduces crime.
And the High Line, of course, really gave a major boost to anybody who owned property near it. That has, in a way, that was a boon for the city because then we did well with taxes. Property taxes went up.
That's exactly right. And that's, one way that you can justify spending on parks is that you get it back in terms of property values. One of the mechanisms that you capture value in and around a place like Central Park or Prospect Park is through the conservancies that essentially operate funded by often the neighbors who benefit the most from a park. So they take over some of those park functions. The High Line is an interesting case because it's a great park. Love it. Wonderful design. People like to take a stroll before or after dinner. It's led to questions about gentrification and displacement that we're very aware of when we build parks, which is why, for example, we have a whole program that converts schoolyards into playgrounds, green playgrounds. We work very closely with the school and the neighborhood to make sure that it's meeting their needs, it's open to the public.
And what about those schoolyards? Because most of them are kind of paved over and kind of bleak.
Paved over, bleak, full of cars. Yeah, that's how we find them. The way we leave them, though, with I have to say, great support of the city, both in helping us pay for it and also in taking care of it over the long term, we leave them green, well painted, and designed by the students.
When you identify a good site, is there some conflict over how it will be used? You transformed a parking lot into a park that you created at PS7 in the Bronx. Was there any pushback from people who used to use that parking lot?
Well, we like to work, sure. I think we do our best to explain the long-term benefits. Also work with DOT and the schools to make sure there's parking for teachers and other people who need it. I think once people see one of our parks, they want one. And so our biggest advocates are school employees who transfer over from another school where we've worked. Not only the principals, but the custodians who are really key players in this.
What's the fitness zone program? You actually have outdoor gyms?
Outdoor gyms, yeah. We have over 100. Largely, they started off in, of course, the warm weather places like California and Florida. But we've been bringing them here. We have several in New Jersey, Elizabeth, New Jersey, and the like. And the insight there is that sometimes you don't have either money or space for a full-fledged park, but can we build a fitness zone that is, as large as say a living room or so? Put outdoor fitness equipment in it, encourage people to use it. It can be along a bike path or even in a New York City Housing Authority development, which we're trying to get off the ground now. And people will use it, and there's research showing that when people need to exercise, of course. We're watching too much TV and screens and not eating well enough and just not active enough. Get people outside, they're automatically more active. And then provide this kind of equipment, it can really move the needle on community health.
What kind of equipment are we talking about?
It can be very simple. The old school fitness zones are the bars, of course, that are fixed. And if you're strong enough to do a pull-up, you can do a pull-up or things like that. But these are a little bit more fun, a little easier for first-time exercisers, where they're movable equipment that you're striding along, or you're, a hand cycle where you're cycling your hands and the like, working out your shoulders.
Isn't it more difficult and expensive to create a new park in a city because land tends to be monetized?
Yeah, I would say land is monetized anywhere. It's just, extremely expensive in a city. Like any other infrastructure, though, we do require investments in it. So I used to run a large infrastructure agency, DEP, and over 10 years they spent $20 billion on the water and wastewater system. Well, parks are really critical to our life as well. So yes, but it's one reason why in our schoolyard program we're focusing on land that is already owned by the city. So right away we don't have to incur the acquisition cost to create a little community park.
Although the city over the years has closed up a number of community gardens, especially when Rudy Giuliani was mayor, because the city owned that land as well and thought, well, maybe we can sell it to some real estate developer.
Look, you have to pay the bills, so I guess I'm sympathetic on one level, but when the community's put in a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, bringing back something, it seems like a penalty if it's taken away. We help protect, with other partners, many of those gardens and in negotiation with the city. So we outright protected 70, several hundred were protected, and they're taken care of by the communities.
And you said earlier that in some cases old warehouses and such become sites for parks. So as businesses leave New York, as New York's whole business structure changes, we may lose some jobs, but we may be gaining some parks?
Well, hopefully we're gaining different kinds of jobs, and losing, as we lose those industrial jobs, we're gaining, in waterfront jobs, we're gaining waterfront parks.
I'm speaking with Carter Strickland, who's the New York State Director of the Trust for Public Land here on WBAI New York 99.5 FM. How did you persuade former Mayor Michael Bloomberg to participate in your program?
Well, I think this was under the Great Sustainability Plan that I worked on in a different capacity, Plan YC, which now is morphed into One NYC with an equity lens, which is a great evolution. But Plan YC, for the first time, pulled together different agencies, which were often very siloed, doing their own thing, to one overarching vision: reduce greenhouse gases, make the city fit for 1 million more people at the time by 2030, they were projecting. And what do we need to do? So it got people thinking creatively, okay, we need more parks. Where do we find it? And the schoolyards, playgrounds program, which in its infancy actually did start under Giuliani on a very small level, and Plan YC just really increased the number of sites that we did.
Bloomberg had a project to plant 1 million trees. I think
Checked.
1 million trees
It's
is a
done.
bit much. What?
It's done. It's done.
It's really? We have 1 million trees?
We have 1 million more trees.
And he accomplished all of that during his administration?
I think the 1 million tree mark was passed after his administration, but it's continued. Street trees are really valuable. They add a lot to us. Not only do they make the street more beautiful, provide shade, lower air conditioning costs, and absorb runoff.
And things have run smoothly, administration to next administration?
Yeah, I mean, there's been different emphasis, but certainly the Sustainability Office has gone strong. I can say that my former agency, DEP, has really continued the green infrastructure work that we did. This was a plan we launched in 2010, got into a consent decree in 2012, and the insight there was use the 30% or more of the city that is roads and sidewalks, the right-of-way, to absorb water. Plant street trees that have tree pits that have a little channel in them to absorb runoff.
So you have a stormwater runoff that helps keep these places green?
Well, plants need water, and so stormwater runoff is one way to do it. The key insight there is that if you make the city sponge-like and absorb rainfall through green roofs, through street tree pits and the like, less water during the rainfall will get into the sewers, and really sewers can get overwhelmed in rainfall, and then we have combined sewer overflows that will dump sewage into the waterways.
We've been talking about places where cities are creating parklands, marginal lands, abandoned railroads, piers. So has the trust been instrumental in transforming some of those properties? We have.
I mean, one place where we do a lot of work is in Atlanta with the Beltway, Chattanooga, Railtown. We've done a lot of rail trails down there. We have done many what we call rail trails, which are you take an abandoned rail line. The railroad doesn't want it anymore. It either wants to sell it outright, or protect its ability to have a rail in the future, but for the next foreseeable future, they want to put a trail in there. We work with them to make that happen.
What's the project called Queensway?
Oh, Queensway is great. We really hope it gets off the ground. So we've been working for the last few years on an overall plan and actually conceptual design for one phase of what we call the Queensway, which is twice as long as the High Lines, 3.5 miles long, 47 acres of city-owned land on the former Rockaway Beach branch, which is in central Queens, runs from Forest Park down to Ozone Park, through a lot of different neighborhoods, or I should say, it's a seam right now between a lot of neighborhoods, and we think it could be connective tissue between, say, Forest Park and Rego Park, where people would meet. Right now, no one can get on it, and we think it's ripe for New York City's next great park.
Why was the Rockaway Beach line abandoned?
Not enough passengers, just uneconomical, and it was abandoned back in the 60s. So
because of cars? Because there was a time when that was the way so many people got to Rockaway or came off of Rockaway.
Yeah, I mean, one could imagine that. Of course, now we have the A line that does service the Rockaways and Long Island Railroad. So there's a lot of different ways that people, can get to the peninsula. The wonderful thing about that land is that it's laid fallow for 60 years. So you have 60-year-old trees, which if you were to build a park from scratch and try to put in a 60-year-old tree, you can't even buy them. So it's really, really precious resource.
Is it likely that the neighborhood the park will pass through in Queens could raise the same kind of money that was raised for the High Line?
No, and I think that's part of the problem. And, it really requires a citywide vision and initiative to invest in it. Just this is it's 3.5 miles long, so it ranges from, working class to poor to middle class neighborhoods in Queens, and even Forest Park, of course, in Forest Hills is a quite wealthy area.
And Forest Park is one of the great treasures of Queens.
It's one of the great treasures. It's really two halves of a park, though. In the middle, there's a seam in the middle, we call it the ravine, that is this old rail bed. So we think turning that into a park would help connect those two halves of Forest Park.
The Trust for Public Land commissioned a study of the benefits of the proposed uses here. What did your report predict?
Well, we predict that, first of all, there's some 300,000 people that live within a mile of this park. So that's 300,000 people that would have a new park in their backyard in areas that often lack a park, especially in the south end towards Ozone Park. It provides a safe place for people to bike and walk. One big motivating factor for this project was that Woodhaven Boulevard, which it parallels, is very dangerous for the bikers and pedestrians. I think the second most dangerous, of course, is not that far from the first most dangerous, which is Queens Boulevard. So we want to provide safe places for people to bike and walk.
Can you accurately track how frequently the small parks and playgrounds that you're creating are used and by whom?
Not right now, and that's actually one of the great sort of frontiers or ongoing projects, I should say, in the park world. We can predict very well using our GIS technology and census data where parks are needed and where we can place a park that's within a 10-minute walk of most people. We can, and right now we're working on various tools, either measuring cell phone data or social media mentions, or old-fashioned counting, which is expensive.
Does Facebook know you're doing that?
They're probably doing it themselves on their own. I mean, one thing with...
I hope the Russians aren't writing all these things down.
If they're worried about park usage, maybe that's a good thing. There are some more automated counters for bike lanes and things where people are zipping by, so that, I think technology at the end of the day is going to come to give us some more useful data.
What's your plan for your new online tool called Parkology?
Parkology is great. So the idea is, please log on to Parkology, search for it, Google it, and the idea is that it will create an online community of park users that will have tools. The idea is to not only for park professionals, of course, at parks and recreation departments all over the country, but park users and motivated citizens will understand all aspects of the park. So it's really a toolkit for citizens and professionals to make better decisions about parks.
What happens when a park becomes an area of conflict? There's this gorgeous park in Greenpoint called McGolrick Park And if, I think it's even on the national, well, it's considered a national treasure. It's gorgeous. But it's a wonderful neighborhood park, and yet there's also a group of kids who terrorize the area. In fact, there's even been a killing in that neighborhood. And then there is another group of alcoholics who sleep there every night. So this wonderful park is there and is underutilized by the people you would think would want it in their neighborhood the most.
It is a challenge. I mean, look.
I suspect it's not the only one.
It's
that
not
has
the only one. Look,
that kind of problem.
If you go back in time, even Central Park, which is such a gem now, had those issues, right, in Prospect Park. The idea is to get better and more professional management of the park. Of course, you involve conservancy, and all of that is elements of displacing bad uses with positive uses. So we often get this when we're building rail trails, for example. The immediate neighbors are worried. They're worried about crime. They're worried about derelict use. Never mind that, in fact, an abandoned strip of land is already seeing those kind of bad uses. What we say, and experience has shown, that when you get people using a park heavily, it does displace bad uses. So I would suspect, not familiar with that particular park. It might need a more focused attention.
But the general prospect, forgive the pun, for parks is a good one?
I think so. I mean, I'm very upbeat. I think there's more and more recognition that parks are critical infrastructure for cities. The same reason I'm optimistic that in New York City, over the last 10 years or so, we've really seen improvements in both water quality and air quality. So citizens can make a difference. This is one way they do make a difference. One sort of emerging body of knowledge surrounds how important parks are in fighting climate change, and both sequestering carbon in soils and in reducing the impacts of climate change.
Do you encourage people like our listeners to get in touch with your organization?
Please do. Check out our website, Trust for Public Land. If you are living in New York City, of course, you can look at how our parks fare at Park Score. I do want to put in a plug for other cities across the country. We've mapped 14,000 cities.
What's the best city?
What's the best city?
I heard
Minneapolis. St. Paul, yeah.
What is it about Minnesota?
I think Minnesota nice, of course, always helps. They have more land. But I think that the real difference there is that they have a really good governance structure. So they have independent funding and management of their parks in a dedicated political body.
Carter Strickland is the New York State Director for the Trust for Public Land. Thank you so much for being on our show today.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
And that brings us to the end of today's show. My great thanks to Fran Higgins, who produced this segment, to Charlie Morrow, who composed our theme music, to Reggie Johnson, who was at the audio controls, and to my assistant producer, Jesse Lent, who makes things run smoothly. Leonard Lopate at Large comes to you on Saturdays at 4 and Tuesdays at noon. You can subscribe to Leonard Lopate at Large podcast on iTunes and by clicking on Robin Hood Radio's archive program site, which is robinhoodradio.com. You can also check out Leonard Lopate at Large Facebook page. We hope to see you next week.